The spring of 1945 arrived in the small German town of Waldheim like a whisper of change carried on winds that still smelled of gunpowder and ash. The war had ended, leaving behind rubble where proud buildings once stood, and silence where laughter used to echo through cobblestone streets. The townspeople had learned to survive on scraps, to hide their valuables, and to keep their daughters close when any army approached. They had seen the Wehrmacht march through in triumph, and they had watched those same soldiers limp back in defeat. But nothing could have prepared them for what was coming down that dirt road on a warm April morning. The rumble of truck engines broke the dawn's silence first. Then came the voices singing in harmony, deep and rich, carrying melodies that sounded nothing like the harsh German commands the town had grown accustomed to. When the convoy finally rolled into view, the townspeople who dared to peek through their shuttered windows felt their breath catch in their throats. These weren't the soldiers they expected. These were black American soldiers, members of the 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, and they were unlike anything this isolated German town had ever seen. Hauptstrasse, the main street that cut through Waldheim like a spine, had witnessed countless military processions over the centuries. Prussian cavalry, Imperial German infantry, Nazi troops in their terrifying precision. But on this day it belonged to men whose ancestors had picked cotton under the Georgia's sun, who had survived Jim Crow's brutal grip, who had fought in a war for a country that denied them the most basic dignities. They arrived not as conquerors drunk on victory, but as liberators exhausted by the weight of what they had seen. Their uniforms were dust-covered, their faces worn, but there was something in their bearing that commanded respect. They had survived the Gothic line in Italy, had pushed through German defenses when others said it couldn't be done, and now they were here, in the heart of the enemy's homeland. Sergeant Marcus Johnson was among them, a tall man from Mississippi whose hands had picked more cotton than he cared to remember before the war gave him an escape. His eyes scanned the shuttered windows, the frightened faces barely visible in the shadows. He had been in enough European towns to know the pattern by now. Fear first, then curiosity, then slowly, cautiously, something that resembled normalcy. But Waldheim felt different. Maybe it was the way the morning light hit the damaged church steeple, or maybe it was the exhaustion finally catching up to him. But something in his gut told him this place would become significant. The Americans set up their headquarters in what remained of the town hall, a building that had somehow survived the Allied bombing runs with only minor damage. The military government needed to establish order, distribute food, root out any remaining Nazi officials, and begin the long process of denosification. It was tedious work, paperwork and interrogations, a far cry from the combat these soldiers had endured. But orders were orders, and the men of the 92nd Infantry Division executed them with the same discipline they had shown on the battlefield. What happened next would become the subject of whispered conversations. Official reports filed and quickly buried, and decades later heated debates about morality, survival, and the unexpected connections forged in the aftermath of total war. If you're already hooked by this true story from history, hit that like button and let me know in the comments if you've ever heard about the Buffalo Soldiers in post-war Germany. And subscribe, because this story goes places you won't believe. The women of Waldheim emerged slowly, like flowers after a harsh winter. At first it was just the brave ones, the desperate ones, those who needed to secure food for their families. The American soldiers had supplies, real food, chocolate, cigarettes, things that had become mythical luxuries during the final years of the war. Frau Weber was among the first. Her husband had died on the Eastern Front, her 2 sons were missing, presumed dead or captured by the Soviets, and she had 3 young daughters to feed. Hunger, she would later say, makes philosophers of us all, strips away the propaganda, reveals what truly matters. She approached the checkpoint with trembling hands, her German pride battling with her maternal desperation. The soldier who greeted her was Private James Washington, a young man from Chicago who had seen his own mother struggle to put food on the table during the Depression. He didn't see an enemy, he saw someone's mother. He processed her papers, asked about her family through his limited German and her broken English, and sent her away with more rations than regulations technically allowed. That small act of kindness opened a floodgate. Within weeks, something remarkable began to unfold in Waldheim. The strict racial laws that had governed Nazi Germany, the propaganda that had poised minds for over a decade, the carefully constructed hierarchy of who was human and who was Untermensch. All of it began to crumble in the face of basic human connection. The black soldiers who had experienced their own version of racial oppression back home, who knew what it meant to be judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character, found themselves in a strange position. Here, in the defeated heart of Nazi Germany, they were treated with a respect many had never experienced in their American hometowns. The irony was not lost on them. Sergeant Johnson wrote in a letter to his sister back in Jackson, Mississippi, "These German folks treat me better than the whites back home ever did. I can walk into any building, sit anywhere I want, and nobody moves away like I got some disease. It's the damnedest thing. We just defeated them in a war, and they're more decent to me than my own countrymen." But it was more than just decent treatment. Something deeper was happening, something that would shock the military brass when reports finally filtered up the chain of command. Romance bloomed in Waldheim. Greta Hoffmann was 19 years old, with blonde hair that fell in waves past her shoulders and blue eyes that had seen too much suffering for someone so young. Her father had been an officer in the Wehrmacht, killed during the Battle of the Bulge. Her mother had died in a bombing raid on Dresden while visiting relatives. Greta had survived alone, working in the fields, hiding from both retreating German soldiers and advancing Allied forces, eating whatever she could forage or steal. When the Americans arrived, she was barely 90 pounds, her beauty hidden beneath dirt and exhaustion. She first saw Corporal David Green when she was standing in line for rations. He was managing the distribution, ensuring fairness, stopping fights before they started. Unlike the German soldiers she had known, who ruled through intimidation and violence, this American soldier used humor and kindness to maintain order. When an elderly man tried to cut in line, David didn't strike him. Instead, he gently guided him back to his place, explaining in careful, simple German about fairness, about everyone getting their share. Greta found herself returning to that line even when she didn't need rations. Just to watch him work, to hear him laugh, to see the way he treated everyone with the same patient dignity. David, for his part, noticed her. How could he not? But more than her physical beauty, he was drawn to the intelligence in her eyes, the way she helped others who couldn't carry their rations, the quiet strength that radiated from someone who had survived hell and remained human. Their first conversation happened by accident. Greta's English was better than most in town, learned secretly during the war from her grandmother who had lived in London before Hitler rose to power. When a misunderstanding erupted between a soldier and an elderly German woman, Greta stepped in to translate. Her voice was soft but clear, her words chosen carefully to ease tension rather than inflame it. David was impressed. After the crisis was resolved, he thanked her and they fell into conversation. She asked about America, about his life before the war. He told her about Philadelphia, about the Negro neighborhoods where life wasn't easy but community was strong, about the jazz clubs on South Street, about his mother's cooking and his father's dignity despite working as a porter on trains. She told him about Waldheim before the war, about festivals and music, about her dreams of becoming a teacher, about the slow poison of Nazi ideology that had infected her town like a disease, about how she had tried to hold on to her humanity even as the world went mad around her. Drop a comment and tell me what you think happened next. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because this story takes an even more controversial turn. Their relationship developed slowly, carefully, both aware of the risks. The American military had strict regulations about fraternization, especially romantic relationships with German civilians. The punishment for violation could include court-martial, reduction in rank, even prison time. For Greta, the risks were different, but equally serious. Despite the Nazi defeat, not everyone in Waldheim had abandoned the old ideology. There were whispers, dark looks, the threat of being labeled a race traitor, a Racenschand, despite the Reich's fall. But love, especially the love born in the aftermath of trauma, doesn't care about regulations or societal approval. It grows where it will, like weeds through concrete, stubborn and irrepressible. They met in secret at first. There was an old barn on the edge of town, partially destroyed by artillery fire, but still offering shelter and privacy. There, away from prying eyes, they talked for hours. David told her about the racism back home, about the separate water fountains in the back of the bus, about the lynchings that went unpunished, about the subtle and not-so-subtle ways Black Americans were told daily that they were less than human. Greta listened with tears in her eyes, recognizing in his stories echoes of what Jews had experienced in Germany, what the Nazis had done to anyone they deemed inferior. "We were taught you were subhuman," she confessed one evening, shame coloring her voice. The propaganda, it was everywhere. In school, in newspapers, in films. They showed us pictures, told us lies, made us believe terrible things. I was just a child when it started. By the time I was old enough to think for myself, the lies were already inside my head. David took her hand, calloused from work and war. "The same lies they tell about us back home," he said. Different words, different accent, same hatred. That's what I'm fighting against, Greta. Not just the Nazis. All of it. Every system that tells a person they're less than human because of how they were born. It was in that barn, among the hay and dust and lingering smell of explosives, that they first kissed. It was gentle, tentative, both aware that they were crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. That kiss represented a rebellion against everything their respective societies had taught them, a rejection of racial laws and propaganda, an affirmation that humanity transcends the arbitrary categories we create to divide ourselves. But they weren't alone. Across Waldheim, other relationships were forming. Private Washington and Frau Weber's eldest daughter, Sophie, found connection over shared love of music. He taught her American jazz, she taught him German folk songs. And somewhere in that exchange of melodies, something deeper took root. Corporal James Brown, a farmer's son from Alabama, fell for Maria Schneider, a widow whose husband had died in Stalingrad. They communicated more through gestures and smiles than words, but that was enough. The town began to change. The initial suspicion gave way to a cautious acceptance, then to something approaching normalcy. The Americans organized dances, bringing their jazz records and teaching the Germans to jitterbug. They shared cigarettes and stories. They played baseball in the damaged streets, teaching local boys the rules, laughing at the cultural confusion. German women taught the soldiers how to bake bread the traditional way, how to make schnitzel from meager rations, how to curse properly in German. This fraternization, especially the romantic relationships between black soldiers and German women, did not go unnoticed. Reports began filtering back to military headquarters. Officers who had never questioned the racial order back home suddenly found themselves confronting an uncomfortable reality. The men they commanded, men they had been taught to view as inferior, were being treated as equals, even as desirables, by white European women. The response was swift and harsh. New orders came down. Fraternization was to be strictly punished. Soldiers were confined to base when not on duty. German women seen with American soldiers would lose their ration cards. Military police patrols increased, their primary mission seemingly to prevent the mixing of races rather than maintain general order. But you can't order people not to feel what they feel. The crackdown only drove the relationships underground, made them more secretive but also more intense. Nothing bonds people quite like being told their love is forbidden. If this story is resonating with you, slam that like button. And comment below, do you think love can transcend the boundaries society places on us? Subscribe so you don't miss how this unfolds. Major Robert Henderson arrived in Waldheim in July 1945 with explicit orders to restore proper military discipline. A white officer from Virginia, Henderson embodied the racial attitudes of the American South. He viewed the fraternization between his black soldiers and German women not just as a violation of military regulations, but as a personal affront to the natural order as he understood it. His first action was to call an assembly of all troops. Standing before them, his face red with barely contained rage, he laid down the law. "You men seem to have forgotten who you are and where you come from," he began, his voice carrying across the assembled soldiers. "You're in Germany as conquerors, not as social equals to these people. And you certainly aren't here to start mongrel families with enemy women." The use of that word mongrel cut through the assembly like a blade. These men had fought for their country, had bled for it, and now they were being told that their humanity was conditional, that the freedom they had fought to protect didn't extend to who they could love. Sergeant Johnson stepped forward, a breach of protocol that could mean punishment, but he didn't care. "Sir, with all due respect, we've been fighting for freedom. Doesn't that freedom include the freedom to choose who we spend time with?" Henderson's eyes narrowed. "You fight for the freedom I tell you to fight for, Sergeant. And right now, I'm telling you that any man caught fraternizing with German civilians will face court-martial." Dismissed. That night, the soldiers gathered in their barracks, voices low and angry. The injustice burned. They had been good enough to die for their country, but not good enough to love who they chose. The irony was crushing. They had defeated fascism abroad only to be confronted with its American cousin at home, even here in occupied Germany. David found a way to get a message to Greta. They met one last time in the barn, both knowing it might be their final opportunity. "I'm being transferred," he told her, his voice breaking. "They're breaking up our unit, sending us to different posts. They think it'll stop what's happening, but they're wrong. What we have, what everyone here has found, it's real. It matters." Greta held him, memorizing the feel of his arms around her, the sound of his heartbeat, the warmth of his skin. "Will you come back?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "I don't know," he admitted honestly, "but I'll try. And if I can't, I need you to know that you've changed me, assured me that the hatred, the prejudice, it's not universal, that people can choose differently." They made love that night, tender and desperate, clinging to each other as if physical connection could stop the forces pulling them apart. When dawn came, they separated, both knowing that the world was not ready for what they represented. The military completed its crackdown. Soldiers were transferred out of Waldheim systematically. The German women who had formed relationships found themselves ostracized by both the remaining Americans and by some in their own community who had never approved. Greta received threatening letters, her windows were broken, someone painted a slur on her door. But something had changed in Waldheim, something that couldn't be undone by orders or intimidation. The women who had loved black soldiers didn't forget. They didn't renounce their feelings to satisfy societal pressure. Instead, they held on to those memories, those connections, as proof that another world was possible. Greta gave birth to David's son 9 months later. She named him Daniel, and she raised him alone, facing the judgment of her town with quiet defiance. Daniel had his father's dark eyes and his mother's blonde hair, a living embodiment of the love that had shocked Waldheim. Other mixed-race children were born in the town, each one a testament to the relationships that had flourished briefly in that strange spring of 1945. These children, called brown babies or occupation children, faced discrimination in Germany. They were reminders of a defeat, of a mixing that made many uncomfortable. But their mothers fought for them, loved them fiercely, refused to let shame determine their children's worth. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what happened to these children and their mothers is a story that history tried to forget. David never made it back to Waldheim. He tried writing letters that often went unanswered, saving money for a trip that military restrictions made impossible. He was sent to Japan as part of the occupation force there, then back to the United States where he was discharged in 1946. He returned to Philadelphia, to a country that was just beginning its long, painful reckoning with civil rights, but that wouldn't truly confront its racial demons for another 2 decades. He carried Greta with him always. Told his wife years later about the German woman who had loved him when the world said such love was impossible. He sent money when he could, packages for a son he never met, letters full of regret and love, and instructions on how to be a man in a world that would judge him for his very existence. Greta kept every letter, every photograph in a box that she would eventually give to Daniel when he was old enough to understand. She never married, though she had offers. How could she, when she had experienced a love that had transcended the deepest divisions humanity could create? How could everyday life compete with that? The story of what happened in Waldheim slowly leaked out over the years. Journalists found the story in the 1950s, but their editors buried it, deeming it too controversial, too likely to inflame racial tensions. Veterans began talking about it in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement, when the parallels between Nazi racism and American segregation became impossible to ignore. By the 1970s, Daniel had grown into a young man, fluent in both German and English, carrying within him the genetic memory of 2 worlds at war. He sought out his father, finally making the trip to Philadelphia, showing up on David's doorstep with his mother's letters and his father's photograph. The reunion was emotional, 2 strangers connected by blood and history. David wept when he saw his son, seeing in Daniel's face echoes of both himself and Greta. They talked for days, filling in the gaps, constructing a narrative of what might have been if the world had been different. Daniel returned to Germany with a new understanding. He began documenting the stories of other brown babies, interviewing their mothers, tracking down their fathers when possible. What emerged was a pattern repeated across Germany wherever black soldiers had been stationed. Love had bloomed in the ruins, relationships that challenged everything both the defeated Nazi regime and the victorious Allied powers believed about race. The mothers spoke of their relationships with a defiance that had only grown stronger with time. Frau Mueller, who had loved a soldier from Georgia, said, "They told us these men were inferior, subhuman. But the Americans who liberated us showed more humanity than any of the so-called superior race ever did. My Heinrich was kinder, gentler, more loving than any German man I had known. The war taught me that propaganda is poison, and that the heart doesn't care about skin color," Maria Schneider, now elderly, remembered. Thomas from Alabama was my second chance at life. My first husband died following Hitler's mad dreams. Thomas taught me to live again, to laugh again. They separated us because narrow-minded people couldn't accept that love doesn't follow their rules. But I regret nothing. The months I had with him were worth all the judgment that came after. These testimonies, collected by Daniel and eventually published in a book that caused controversy on both sides of the Atlantic, revealed a truth that made many uncomfortable. The black soldiers who had been deemed second-class citizens in their own country had been embraced by women who had been indoctrinated in Nazi racial ideology. The collision of these 2 systems of oppression had somehow created a space where genuine human connection could flourish. Comment below if you think this story should be taught in schools, and if you haven't liked this video yet, do it now. This history matters. The military's attempt to suppress these relationships revealed the uncomfortable truth that racism wasn't unique to Nazi Germany. America's own system of segregation, its anti-miscegenation laws, its brutal enforcement of racial boundaries, all of it was exposed as fundamentally similar to what the Nazis had practiced. The Nazis had even studied American Jim Crow laws when developing their own racial policies. The victors and the vanquished were mirrors of each other, both committed to keeping races separate, both terrified of what might happen if people were free to love across racial lines. By the 1990s, many of the brown babies had children of their own, creating a legacy that stretched across generations. They formed organizations, connecting with each other, sharing their experiences of growing up mixed race in post-war Germany. Some had gone to America to find their fathers. Some had stayed in Germany and built lives despite the discrimination. All carried within them the story of Waldheim and countless towns like it. The soldiers themselves, those who survived into old age, spoke with increasing openness about what happened. At veteran reunions, the men of the 92nd Infantry Division would gather and remember. They remembered the combat, the fear, the brotherhood forged in battle. But they also remembered the spring of 1945, remembered the German towns where they had been treated like human beings, where women had looked at them with desire rather than disgust, where for a brief moment the color of their skin hadn't determined their worth. Sergeant Marcus Johnson, in one of his last interviews before his death in 2001, said, "People ask me what I'm proudest of from the war. They expect me to talk about battles, about medals. But what I'm proudest of is that we showed those German people that the propaganda was lies. We showed them that black men could be gentle, could be kind, could be worthy of love. And they showed us that not all white people believed the poison they were taught. For a moment, we all just got to be human together. That's what I fought for, even if I didn't know it at the time." The town of Waldheim today has a small memorial erected in 2015 marking the 70th anniversary of the war's end. The plaque mentions the American liberation, the difficult years of occupation, the slow rebuilding, but it doesn't mention what happened between the black soldiers and the German women. That history remains controversial, too complex for official commemoration, too challenging to the narratives both Germany and America prefer to tell about themselves. Yet the truth persists. In family photo albums, in boxes of letters kept in attics, in the memories of the now elderly children born of those forbidden relationships. They're living proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, even when systems of hatred seemed omnipotent, people found ways to connect, to love, to rebel against the artificial boundaries imposed on the heart. The story of Waldheim is not a simple tale of good versus evil. It's more nuanced, more challenging. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how racism operated on both sides of the Atlantic, how systems of oppression can mirror each other even when they're supposedly at war, how love can be both an act of rebellion and a path to healing. Greta Hoffman died in 2008 at the age of 82. At her funeral, Daniel read from the letters his father had sent over the decades. He spoke of his mother's courage, her refusal to be ashamed, her insistence that the love she shared with David had been real and good, and worth the price she paid. He introduced his own children, David's grandchildren, and spoke of how their very existence was a testament to the possibility of overcoming hatred. "My mother used to tell me," Daniel said, his voice breaking, "that the war destroyed so much, but it also created unexpected possibilities. It shook the world so hard that all the carefully maintained boundaries cracked. And through those cracks, light got in. She and my father were that light. All the couples like them were that light. They weren't trying to make a political statement. They just loved each other. But that love was revolutionary because it showed that the lies we're told about each other aren't true. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it challenged what you knew about history, then subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell. Share this video. These are the stories that change how we see the world." The legacy of what happened in Waldheim and towns like it across occupied Germany extends beyond the individuals involved. It foreshadowed the civil rights movement, demonstrated that racial boundaries were artificial and could be crossed, proved that attraction and love didn't respect the categories society tried to impose. The black soldiers who experienced being treated as equals by white women in Germany came home with a new consciousness, a refusal to accept second-class citizenship, a determination to fight for the freedom they had helped secure for others. Many became activists in the civil rights movement. They had seen another way was possible, had lived it, if only briefly. They brought that experience home, used it to fuel their resistance to segregation. When white Americans argued that integration was unnatural, these veterans could say from personal experience, that's a lie. The German women who loved these soldiers had their own revelation. They learned that the categories of superior and inferior races were fabrications, that the men they were taught to fear and despise were capable of great tenderness, great courage, great love. This knowledge didn't make them popular. Many faced ostracism that lasted years, even decades, but they persisted, raising their children to reject the hatred that had nearly destroyed their country. teaching them that humanity transcends race. The children born of these relationships became bridges between worlds, living embodiments of connection in a divided time. They grew up German but with African American heritage, European but connected to a black experience, always straddling categories. Always reminding people that the boundaries we draw between groups are permeable and ultimately meaningless. Today, historians are finally beginning to seriously study this chapter of post-war history. Academic papers are being written, documentaries produced, oral histories collected before the last of the participants pass away. What they're finding challenges the neat narratives we prefer about the war, about racism, about how social change happens. The story reveals that resistance to racial oppression happened in unexpected places, that humanity asserted itself even in the aftermath of humanity's greatest crime, that ordinary people making personal choices about who to love can have revolutionary implications. It shows that the end of World War II wasn't just about the defeat of fascism, but about the beginning of a longer struggle against racial oppression that continues to this day. The shock that Waldheim's women caused wasn't about scandal or impropriety. It was about the subversion of an entire worldview. By choosing to see black soldiers as fully human, as worthy of love and respect, these women rejected not just Nazi ideology but also the American system of segregation that the liberating army brought with them. They chose a third path, one that neither the defeated Germans nor the victorious Americans had anticipated. This choice came with consequences. The women faced social ostracism, economic hardship, sometimes violence. Their children grew up marked as different, struggling to find acceptance in a society that wasn't ready for what they represented. The soldiers faced punishment, transfer, separation from people they loved. But despite all of it, despite the forces arrayed against them, they persisted in their connection. That persistence is the real story of Waldheim. Not just that love happened, but that it endured despite everything designed to destroy it. In letters that crossed the Atlantic for decades, in money sent to support children fathers couldn't raise, in memories kept alive and passed down, in eventual reunions between fathers and children, the connection persisted. Before this video ends, I need you to do something. Like this video, if you believe these stories matter. Comment and tell me what you learned today. And subscribe, because history like this deserves to be remembered, deserves to be shared, deserves to shape how we think about our present. The spring of 1945 in Waldheim was brief. Just a few months when the normal order of things was suspended, when people got to choose who they loved without regard to the racial laws that governed both Nazi Germany and Jim Crow America. It was an anomaly, a crack in history through which possibility poured. The authorities on both sides worked hard to close that crack, to restore the old order, to separate the lovers and erase the evidence of what had happened. But they failed. Not completely, not permanently, but they failed nonetheless. Because love leaves evidence. It leaves children, memories, letters, photographs. It changes people fundamentally, makes them unable to return to who they were before. The soldiers who loved German women couldn't go back to accepting segregation without question. The women who loved black soldiers couldn't go back to believing the propaganda about racial inferiority. The children born of these unions couldn't help but embody the possibility of a world beyond racial division. This is why the story matters. Not because it's a simple tale of triumph, because it isn't. Many of these relationships ended in separation and heartbreak. The couples were torn apart, their children grew up without fathers, the women faced harsh judgment. But even in its tragedy, even in its incompleteness, the story testifies to human resilience, to the stubborn persistence of love in hostile conditions, to the possibility of connection across the deepest divides. When Daniel Hoffman stood at his mother's grave in 2008, he carried with him letters from people around the world who had read about her story. Children of other brown babies, historians fascinated by this forgotten chapter, veterans who had served with his father, people who had been moved by the courage it took to love across racial lines in 1945. The story had traveled far beyond Waldheim, had become part of a larger narrative about human dignity, about resistance to oppression, about the revolutionary nature of love. My mother was an ordinary woman, Daniel said that day. She didn't set out to make history or prove a point. She just fell in love with a man who happened to be black, happened to be American, happened to be in her town at a moment when the world was being remade. But by following her heart, by refusing to be ashamed, by raising me with pride despite the cost, she did something extraordinary. She helped crack open the cage of racial hatred, not just for herself, but for all of us. That's the legacy of Waldheim, the legacy of what the women did that shocked the town, shocked the military authorities, shocked anyone invested in maintaining racial boundaries. They loved. They chose humanity over ideology, connection over separation, hope over fear. And in doing so, they became part of the long, difficult, ongoing struggle to build a world where the color of one's skin doesn't determine one's destiny. The black soldiers who arrived in Germany in 1945 came as conquerors, as liberators, as representatives of American power. But they left as something more complex, as men who had experienced, however briefly, being treated as fully human by people who had been taught to hate them. That experience changed them, armed them with knowledge that would fuel the coming civil rights struggle. They had seen that change was possible, that the racial order was not inevitable, that another world was within reach. The women of Waldheim who loved these soldiers became, in their own way, freedom fighters, not with weapons or speeches, but with their choices, their defiance, their refusal to let society dictate their hearts. They paid a price for this, but they also won something precious, the knowledge that they had lived according to their own values, that they had chosen love over hate, that they had participated in creating something beautiful even in the midst of devastation. And the children, the living bridges between worlds, carry forward a message that remains relevant decades later, that our common humanity transcends the categories we create, that love is stronger than hatred, that people can choose differently than their societies demand, and that every such choice, however personal, is also political, is also revolutionary, is also part of the long arc of history bending toward justice. This is the story they didn't teach you in school. This is the story that complicates our neat narratives about World War II and its aftermath. This is the story that shows love as an act of resistance. If you made it this far, you're part of keeping this history alive. Subscribe, share this video, tell someone about what happened in Waldheim, because the world needs to know that even in the darkest times, love finds a way. Even when everything is designed to keep people apart, connection happens. Even when the authorities try to erase what occurred, the truth persists in the hearts of those who lived it and in the lives of those who descended from it. That's the real shock of Waldheim. Not that it happened, but that it mattered, that it changed people, that it became part of the larger story of humanity's slow, painful, necessary journey toward recognizing that we all belong to each other, regardless of race, nationality, or the artificial boundaries we've spent so much energy maintaining. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about stories that matter. Now go forth and remember, love is always revolutionary.